got Operation Northwoods. That was when the U.S. military and Joint Chiefs of Staff planned to blame Cuba for a false flag operation on its own country. AKA, the CIA would have launched legit terrorist attacks on U.S. soil if it wasn't for the one and only John Fitzgerald Kennedy. This one shows the extraordinary lengths the U.S. military and intel agencies were willing to go to justify an invasion of Cuba and assassinate Castro during the Cold War era, and of course documented proof that without a genuinely moral leader at the helm, false flags are all too plausible. So in a nutshell, Northwoods involved staging a series of false flag terrorist attacks on American soil and blaming them on the Cuban government. It included plans to hijack planes, sink boats, explode bombs, and stage shootings on American soil, which would have involved deliberately harming and killing American citizens to create a false narrative that would justify a full-scale invasion of Cuba. The rift between JFK and the military continued during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Joint Chiefs hoped to deploy nuclear missiles against the Soviets and invade Cuba, but JFK stood tall once again. He said no, and he may very well be the reason that Northwoods didn't happen and the reason that there was no nuclear exchange with the Soviets during the Cold War. Operation Northwoods flows quite nicely. Into the broader context of the evil empire's playbook, a history of American false flag operations. And so, starting in 1898 with the explosion of the USS Maine to justify the Spanish-American War, the Gulf of Tonkin to justify the Vietnam War, Operation Gladio when civilians were killed in bombings by the CIA-trained guerrilla armies in Europe who were trained by a Nazi general who was tight with Allen Dulles. Additionally, we have the false narrative of the sinking of the Lusitania to justify our entrance into World War I, the intentional provocation of Pearl Harbor to justify our entrance into World War II and to create the Manhattan Project, and last but not least, the craziest, most classified false flag of them all, which occurred in September of '01 on our home turf as reason to dominate the Middle East for decades to come. And so, gonna have to put out a bit of a disclaimer here. Parallel to the chain of false flags, we have the chain of American-backed coups. There's way too many to name, so I'll just cover the most profound ones. Quickly going to read off. We got the annexation of Hawaii in 1893, the Philippines in 1898, 1953 in Iran, aka Operation Ajax. We got the 1954 Banana Republic coup in Guatemala, 1950s in Puerto Rico, the 1960s, the Congo crisis, the failed coup in Cuba in the 60s, of course. We have 1963 in Vietnam, 1963 in Iraq, also 2003 in Iraq, and the smear campaign against Saddam Hussein and the lies about their possession of weapons of mass destruction. We got 1963 and 2009 in Honduras, 1964 in Brazil, 1965 Dominican Republic, 1973 in Chile, and the infamous rise of Augusto Pinochet. The decade-long coup in the 80s with Nicaragua and the Iran-Contra affair, funded by the CIA's mass cocaine smuggling and the death of reporter Gary Webb and the Dark Alliance. We got 1982 in Chad, Afghanistan in the 80s, Libya in 2011 with Gaddafi, Operation Condor in South America, and the list goes on and on. But this stark history of de facto American-backed coups paints a picture of a nation that has repeatedly used its military and economic might to shape the world in its own image, almost always at the expense of the freedom and well-being of people in other countries. This trail of American-backed coups is no doubt a sobering reminder of the dark side of American foreign policy and the need for greater accountability and respect for international law. And so following this was the lesser-known domestic coup of Richard Nixon. So when you look into the truth about Watergate, you realize what Watergate actually was. It was not the exposure of a conspiracy, but the conspiracy itself. It was a sophisticated deep state operation to remove the most popularly elected president in U.S. history. The actual evidence points to something far more sinister than a third-rate burglary. It reveals a coup orchestrated by unelected intelligence officials who used a naval intelligence officer turned reporter in Bob Woodward, the FBI's second-in-command in Mark Felt, and a team of CIA operatives to destroy a president who had begun asking dangerous questions about who really runs America. And so from JFK to Watergate to RFK, a pattern emerges from 1961 to 76 of how the deep state eliminated presidents and installed puppets during the most insane period in American history. This marked a period of time when unelected power captured American democracy. The pattern revealed, take a look at this And so from JFK to Watergate to RFK, a pattern emerges from 1961 to 76 of how the deep state eliminated presidents and installed puppets during the most insane period in American history. This marks a period of time when unelected power captured American democracy. Take a look at this completely absurd timeline. It all starts with Eisenhower, the OG, who warned about the deep state in his iconic farewell address. He left office alive but ignored, and of course he coined the term military-industrial complex in that farewell speech. Of course, it was JFK, the peace prophet, who challenged the deep state and was assassinated. LBJ served the deep state and was rewarded with power. Bobby Kennedy threatened to expose his brother's killers and challenged the deep state. He was assassinated. Richard Nixon fought the deep state. He was too difficult to control, and he was forced to resign. Spiro Agnew threatened the deep state. He was removed preemptively on trumped-up tax evasion charges from years ago. And, of course, Gerald Ford was installed by the deep state to clean up their mess. Of course, he was a prominent member of the Warren Commission. And so this pattern shows that presidents who challenged the emerging shadow government were systematically removed and replaced by compliant puppets who served unelected power. This was not politics as usual. It was a methodical restructuring of American governance where bullets, scandals, and backroom deals transferred power from elected reformers to installed managers. The pattern is so clear, so consistent, that dismissing it as coincidence requires more faith than accepting it as conspiracies. And in my mind, 61 to 76 is probably the most crucial period of American history. It represents the time when the deep state truly was able to take over democracy. And so another prime example of the deep state's actions against democracy was the FBI's war